Hi, Damai, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I hope are both a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant and Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, affordable, enjoyable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the inspiring people I've met about what needs to change if we're to have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm delighted to be talking with two remarkable leaders in the food system. We're going to explore how to make food systems healthier, fairer, and a force for environmental good. So my two guests are Angela Clifford, the CEO of Eat New Zealand, an initiative that's reconnecting people with food and where it comes from, the land and the oceans. Angela also runs a permaculture farm, and I personally have benefited a lot from her tutorship around how to produce sustainable food. So thank you, Angela, and welcome. And my second guest is Sue Pritchard, the Chief Executive of a UK charitable organisation called the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. And I'm sure during the course of the podcast we'll learn more about what the Food Farming and Countryside Commission does. But as well as being the Chief Executive of that organisation, Sue is an organic livestock farmer in Wales, also farming for conservation. And Sue is also Governor of the UK's Royal Agricultural University. So with that, Angela, as I mentioned, I've benefited personally and directly from your experience in trying to grow food in a sustainable way. And I'm also intrigued professionally by the work you're doing through Eat New Zealand. So perhaps you could tell the listeners a bit about your journey to what you're doing today.
Yes, I think that it has always been really important to me, if I'm to talk about food and how we find it, how we access it, and how we eat it, to have my hands in the soil, because I understand the complexities of getting food from the farm to the plate or from the ocean to the plate, and it keeps you really humble. So it's very difficult to be grandiose or to overstep and talk about food at a big level if you don't grow it on a daily basis, or if you do grow it on a daily basis. So I think that for me is the nexus, or the point at which the two parts of my life join. The part that grows food for my family and helps other people learn how to do so, and the part of my life that speaks to national food systems and global food systems.
And so what are you aiming to achieve through Eat New Zealand, in your own words? I kind of summarised it, but possibly badly.
Not at all. I think you're right. So what are the opportunities to reconnect people to our natural and our environment through our kai, or through our food? And we think that it's that reconnection, that journey back to where our food comes from, that holds the key or the answers to so many of the issues that we find in the food system at the moment. So it's a physical connection back to place, but it's also the way that we tell our stories and how we turn around and explain to the world who we are as a food nation. We think that reconnection is the key piece.
Thanks, and there's a lot in that I'd like to come back to and unpack a bit more. But before I do, I'd like to invite Sue into the conversation. And Sue, you've spent a couple of weeks now, a month in fact, in New Zealand, in our food nation. But before we get some of your reflections on what you've seen, perhaps you could talk a bit about your own journey and the work that you're doing at the Food Farming and Countryside Commission.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here with both of you today. I have really, really enjoyed the conversations we've had thus far. The Food Farming and Countryside Commission was set up in 2016 by a steering group of business, NGO and civil society leaders, really in response to the UK's vote to exit the European Union. It was a pretty critical moment in UK history and required a complete rethink about our food policy, our farming policy, our environment policy, indeed our place in the world. And that steering group of leaders recognised that we needed to bring fresh voices, perhaps some might say seldom heard voices, into discussions to shape that version of the future that we needed now to think hard about and co-create for ourselves as a country, as a nation, and across sectors. So we were set up with the benefit of very generous philanthropic funding. We're an independent commission, independent from government, and we guard that independence very ferociously. It's very important to us in terms of the work that we do and in terms of the credibility of the work that we do. We're led by a really stellar group of commissioners from across the system. Our chair is Serene Cheshire, vice chair is Dame Fiona Reynolds, and we have another 15 commissioners drawn from leaders across the system, the food, farming, environment, economic system, who help shape our work. We were initially set up for 2 years to produce a report, to make some recommendations for the UK's future outside of the European Union. But very quickly we realised there were more than one problem to tackle in front of us. As well as leaving the European Union, we're facing an ecological crisis, climate crisis, a nature crisis, and indeed a health and equity crisis. So our work folds in all of those challenges into taking a more strategic view of the future. We produced our report in 2019, and as part of that process, we sought to centre the voices of citizens in those recommendations. In fact, we did what independent inquiries always do. We did a literature review, we invited contributions from national experts in their field, but we also set off around the UK on a bicycle. My researchers spent 9 months travelling the whole of the UK on a bike, going directly to communities, to citizens in communities, citizens on businesses, farms, to ask them what they cared about, to show us what they cared about, what really mattered to them, and what they...
After a little technical hitch when we were face-to-face in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, I'm really delighted to reconnect with you both over this important conversation. And Sue, you mentioned that your researchers headed out around the UK on bicycles, and I'm really interested to hear maybe 2 or 3 of the most important things that they heard as they had those conversations with people in the UK about food.
Yes. Technical hitches were a bit of a feature of going around the UK on a bicycle, as you can imagine, but it was a really important piece of the inquiry process for us, because first of all it was demonstrating that we were absolutely committed to hearing from people in their places, in their communities, and using quite simple sort of ethnographic methods. Really, we were hearing from people about what they care about, what matters to them, allowing them to show us what matters to them in their own circumstances, in their own situation. And that gave rise to a huge body of material, over 500,000 words we gathered and used to populate our more formal report, which I might mention in a moment. But the big things that we were hearing from citizens was first a bit of gratitude and relief that we were out and about asking them. They really enjoyed being invited to participate in the process and to have that opportunity to speak to us in their own words, in their own way, not in some kind of, focus group in a grim hotel on the edge of a grim town at, a wet November evening with post-its and so on. So being able to speak to us in their own words was really, really important to them. They were really grateful that somebody was taking food and farming and the rural context seriously, because for lots of them, they perceived that it was one of those things that people didn't really understand or just didn't really see the point of policy for it. And that's become a theme for us in our more recent work. And I think the third thing we realised and were able to really build into our report was that people are already doing things. When governments and policymakers kind of sit in our case in Westminster, Whitehall, or in the devolved nations, and they say, we must get people to do a thing, What they often fail to realise is that people are already really busy doing things. They're doing the thing that feels right for their circumstances, but very often they're doing the most innovative, the most creative things. They're experimenting with new methods, new practices, new forms of relationships in communities. And that kind of richness of experience, innovation and creativity and participation is so often invisible in our policy making in the UK, and being able to bring that to life was fantastic. So all of that helped us produce our final report, and our final report had 4 big recommendations. The first was around healthy food, and our kind of strapline was that healthy food is everybody's business and we need to level the playing field for a fair food system. The second bucket of recommendations were around the fact that farming can and must be a force for positive change, with a transition plan for agroecology to 2030. And then the third was around the countryside needing to work better for everyone. In that, we developed the idea of a land use framework and how we could mediate complex land use decisions in the rural environment, but also in peri-urban environments too. And then the last one, which kind of has become a cross-cutting theme, is about resource flows, that money has to flow where the real work is needed. And so that was that gave rise to our report, Our Future in the Land, in 2019. And then it was received very well with politicians across the aisle, both sides of the political aisle, and also by farmers, green groups, citizen groups. So we were hugely relieved that we had been able to find, with their help, a kind of sweet spot, the common ground to organise around. And then our funders and our stakeholders thought we should perhaps stick around and help put our recommendations into practice. And that's what we have been doing ever since, for the last 5 years now.
It sounds like an amazing piece of work, and there's so much in that I'd like to kind of explore. But before we kind of unpack that a bit more, Angela, are you aware of anything kind of similar having been undertaken in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
I guess the short answer is no. It sounds amazing, and I know as an organisation that that's exactly what we'd like to do, and that's what we've asked the government for, is a community-led, co-designed way forwards, and we think that's the only way forward, is co-design. So I don't think it has happened. There were some elements of co-design that fed into the Manakai initiative with Aotearoa Circle, and that was a process that I was involved in that really sought to bring a whole lot of varied and different voices around the table, and I'd never really seen that in the New Zealand food system before. So I know that we have the capacity to do it, but there just really isn't any resourcing to be able to deliver a truly co-designed version of what comes next for New Zealand food.
And I wonder if part of the issue might be that there's not perhaps quite so apparently the kind of burning platform that was present in the UK with the kind of Brexit. We could argue there's an enormous burning platform, burning very brightly, but perhaps that's part of the issue. What do you think?
I'm just wondering how many burning platforms we actually need before we consider it a burning platform, because New Zealand's outcomes in our food system are absolutely dire. We've got 20% of our children in food poverty. We have some of the highest diet-related illness in the world. We have massive biodiversity loss and major land use implications that are affecting environmental outcomes for New Zealand. We're not particularly good at reflecting our Indigenous food culture. I mean, I could line up the burning platforms to perhaps make a burning pontoon out into the lake of ridiculousness. So yeah, we have burning platforms.
Thanks, Angela. Obviously, I agree with all of that. Sue, you've been in Aotearoa, New Zealand recently for 4 weeks travelling around. Does any of what Angela say kind of resonate for you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had the most wonderful time, not just thanks to your generosity in introducing me to folk and showing me around, but it's such a beautiful, spectacular, diverse country. And my daughter and I travel, through North Island and South Island, and we're able to see a lot of the diversity. But I think, pondering what Angela was saying there, of course, she's absolutely right. Brexit was our initial burning platform, but at FFCC, we very quickly moved to talk about climate, nature, health and inequality. But what I have to remind people over and over again when we talk about policy change and why it's so difficult to get policy change is that the tricky reality is that actually this very dysfunctional food system that we're living in actually does work quite well for some very powerful actors. And I was struck in one of my meetings with government officials when I first came over, who was just telling me in the context of the new government strategy that they would be looking very closely at regenerative agriculture because their customers wanted them to. And I said, oh, your citizens are calling for regenerative agriculture. I thought that's how radical. But he said, no, that's not our customers. We're an export-led country and our customers are Nestle and Danone. And that's what they need us to do so that they can fulfill their obligations under climate and nature disclosures. And I think that really brought home to me that your agriculture system, which is, famous the world over for the way that it operates without subsidy, operates now for a global marketplace, and a global marketplace with its own interests, which is clearly not always shared with the interests of your citizens. So, we had to work quite hard to find the kind of foodie culture. We did find it, of course we did. We were committed to that task. And it was great coming to the food festival with you too. But tell me if I misinterpreted this, but there seems to be quite the separation between agriculture for the export sector and the idea of more resilient agriculture and food production that will service the needs of your citizens for now and in the long term. And that seems to me to be a pretty big question.
I think so. And Angela, you're smiling. I'm sure you want to come in here with a comment.
I'm just nodding so furiously that my head's about to fall off. Yes, absolutely. And, getting back to that term citizen and food citizen, I mean, clearly our food system should work for us as New Zealanders. That's surely the purpose of our food system in Aotearoa, is to ensure that we have access to good food to keep ourselves well. And so if that's not the case, if that's not what our food system is for, then I wonder whether ordinary New Zealanders understand that, or food citizens or eaters understand that. And what can we do in terms of redesign as food citizens to ensure that it delivers to us the way that it needs to, which is not to take away from the fact that our food is one of our biggest export earners and is an important part of our economy. It's always important to acknowledge and remember that. But I also don't think it has to be an either or conversation. It can be an and conversation. So how can we have a thriving food export industry, but also a thriving domestic local food system that delivers to us on a whole lot of other levels as well?
And I guess part of possibly answering that really important question might be to do something similar perhaps to some of the work that the Food Farming and Countryside Commission have done in the UK. That might help. But I just want to go off on a slight tangent for a second, because I think language and words are really important. And Sue, you've been very particular in talking about citizens in the context of the work that you're doing. And Angela, from previous conversations you and I have had, I know you're allergic to the term consumers in relation to human beings. And I'd just like you to unpack that a bit, because I think that's important in the context of this conversation.
Yeah, I don't like the idea of humans being defined by their consumption. I think that it limits us. I also think it others us when we talk about who we are. when we talk about consumers, we automatically in our minds, we skip to other people. We don't see ourselves in that position. Whereas if we use a term like eater, we all know that we all eat if we're lucky. So it prevents that othering, which I think is super important. And also, I just like to think that humans can do more than just consume. We can create, we can give, we can do a whole lot of other things. So I just avoid that term wherever possible.
Thank you. Yeah. And Sue, am I right that you were very intentional in your use of the word citizen?
Absolutely. I too abreact seriously to the word consumer, unless it's being used in a very particular context, because it just puts us in one relationship with the economy, with the market economy. And of course, we're very, very much more than that. So we aggressively use the word citizen, and we use it to demonstrate that we each have many, many relationships with the public sphere and with each other. And that's the best word I've got to describe that kind of web of relationships with each other, with communities, with the natural world, with all of those other interests that we have in our lives that aren't just about what we choose to spend our money on. And that's been at the heart of our current really big project that I know we had great fun talking about how we could connect up about this, which is a very big citizen engagement project that we have started. And in fact, we've just had another deliberation since I've come back from New Zealand, which we launched in Westminster yesterday, which is called the Food Conversation. And it simply asks, through a whole series of citizen assembly type events around the UK, so what do we really want from food? And using that really simple question and inviting people in through a very rigorous sortition process, the kind of gold standard process that makes sure you get a really good cross-section of people from a community, we talk to them about food and health, food and farming, food and land use, food and climate, food and nature, food and trade, food and justice. We talk a lot about power relations in the food system, which are otherwise completely invisible to most citizens. And using just very simple but quite rigorous processes, we have been generating an incredible richness of response from citizens, which up on our website, your listeners can perhaps have a look if they're interested, of hearing from citizens directly, citizens speaking directly about what they want from food, and perhaps most importantly, what they want government and business to do about acting on this currently dysfunctional food system. It's an incredible, I think it's an incredible project, not because I'm organising it, but because it is so inspiring. And just a little anecdote from the launch yesterday. We launched in Westminster. We had MPs and policy leads in the room with us. And we had some citizens in the room who'd just been through that deliberation, one from the previous one last year. And we had a lovely film of citizens' voices talking about the kinds of topics that they'd been covering. And one person said, I find it really hard to believe that you did select these participants rigorously, because it looks to me as if they were planted because they are so consistent and so clear in their messaging. Now, he was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think he was testing the process. And I couldn't help but say, isn't it amazing? Who'd have thought that when you ask citizens to explore difficult issues, they turn out to be thoughtful and intelligent and insightful and respectful with each other? And people had a bit of a hollow laugh, but I think the point was made that we allow ourselves to be persuaded that you can't ask citizens difficult questions because they won't get it, they won't understand, they'll ask for the impossible. None of that proves to be true in my experience. And the reason that we are investing in this citizen conversation, the food conversation in the UK, is to drive home in an election year for us. We will be having an election at some point this year. Doesn't look like May now, unless there's an announcement this morning. In this election year, that politicians need to take food seriously, and that, far from thinking it's too complicated, citizens are full of really good ideas and responses and ways to balance the tricky trade-offs that we have to explore in this space.
So the $1 million question that I have briefly from you, Sue, is So the consistent message that those citizens were giving when you were at Westminster the other day?
So citizens want a fairer, healthier, greener food system. It's incredibly consistent across that. And they want government to take action. They completely reject the kind of arguments we've had in the UK. No one wants a nanny state. People don't really care about this kind of thing. These are middle class concerns. We can't do this in a cost of living crisis. They reject all of those arguments. They expect government to act to ensure that everyone has easy access to healthy, affordable food. They reject the idea that that means if food gets more expensive, that's going to be a problem. They want a fairer system for farmers. And they recognise that if food is expensive and people can't afford it, then that's an economic question. It's not about making food cheaper. It's about tackling the economics of poverty, and that's an entirely different policy question. They want governments to take stronger action on polluters. So we have a principle in some of our legislation in the UK, the polluter pays principle, which says that if you as a company you do the polluting, then you have to be responsible for remedying that, or not polluting in the first place, but certainly remedying it. And they extend that not just to environment degradation, but to poor quality foods. They've got some really strong views on junk food, on the high volume of UPFs in the food system, on the marketing of junk food to children and young people, about the really insidious ways that companies are constantly persuading people to buy food that's bad for them and bad for the planet. So they're really quite assertive in their ask of government to take food systems seriously and to use the power of government to put proper guardrails in for business and to make sure that a healthier, greener, fairer food system is the default position in the UK.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just for listeners, Sue mentioned UPF, which I believe you mean ultra processed foods.
Yes, that's a very hot topic in the UK at the moment. And it has proved to be one of those topics. Sometimes you get a zeitgeist topic that people can really get and understand and relate to. The rise of ultra-processed foods in the UK has been really, really startling. Now, 60 to 70% of people's diets in the UK is made up of ultra-processed foods. And the evidence that ultra-processed foods, the high degree of processing in ultra-processed foods is having really significant health impacts, really showing up. In the UK at the moment, children are actually getting shorter. And researchers are suggesting that is as a result of the poorer diet, particularly poor children. The poorer diet, children are now getting shorter, which is shocking. We should be outraged by that kind of, and actually it turns out citizens in our food conversation are and require government to respond.
And so, Angela, you've not had the benefit of that kind of structured, systematic project that Sue's just talked so eloquently about. But I know that you talk to a lot of people about connection with food and views on food. What are you hearing in New Zealand on these topics?
I think the first thing I want to say is that I would really like the opportunity for New Zealand and New Zealanders to be able to step into that conversation. I mean, that would be amazing and so important. So it's super important that I don't preempt what they might say because I genuinely don't know. And I think it's really important that genuine co-design looks like me not leading it, but listening to everybody around the table. So that it's really important that what I am hearing is my interpretation or my views only or my opinion. And I would never want to preempt a citizen-led conversation in that space. But yes, absolutely a lot of what Sue is talking about in this space is definitely what we're hearing. For us, access to good food is such an issue. So our ability to afford our food, we're the fourth highest, most expensive food in the OECD in New Zealand. So the unaffordability of good food here is just so striking that I think that it leads a lot of other conversations. And I think that's something that we continue to come back to, and I would imagine would be something wherever we travelled around New Zealand that became part of the conversation potentially.
And in our conversation, could we explore for a moment the question of food resilience, which, Sue, isn't something that you've mentioned has come up in the conversations. Perhaps that hasn't, and you haven't mentioned it, but it certainly feels post-COVID like a real vulnerability with, global supply chains, just-in-time inventory management and so on. Have either of you got any thoughts on that as an issue?
So food resilience is a big topic in the UK, partly triggered by the Brexit vote, because we have different trading relationships now. We have more difficult trading relationships with our nearest neighbours. We obviously have a land border in Ireland. And climate change is changing weather patterns. We held a really good workshop just a couple of weeks ago called From Food Security to Food Resilience, because we think the debate at the moment in the UK, at least, when we talk about food security, we tend to take a somewhat reductive approach to it, and it's all about productivity and it's all about yields, and it's kind of doing what we do already but doing it a bit better, and making sure that we can snap back from shocks as they arise. But as our keynote speaker, Professor Tim Benton, explained to us, the shocks are now coming thick and fast from everywhere in the globe, from all of our markets, and where we import from, but also in the UK too, climate shocks, geopolitical shocks. And so we need to be asking the question, not how do we get back to normal as quickly as possible, but how do we redesign a system so that it's much more resilient to respond to any number of probably as yet unforeseen shocks that are likely to come in the next 10 or 20 years, possibly even sooner. And that means rethinking our relationship with what we grow and where we grow it, and rethinking our relationship with demand and consumption. And that's very much part of our food conversation as well. Thinking about, what would we expect to see on the shelves in our shops? How would we be expecting to provide for ourselves, taking more responsibility for growing more of what we can grow in our particular ecology in the UK? And having fairer trading relationships with other countries so that we are importing, exporting those sorts of products that it makes most sense for each of us to grow, rather than trying to kind of force our land and our landscapes to grow things for us that they're just not able to do, and then overusing inputs, either fertilizers or pesticides and herbicides, which are themselves doing terrible damage to our own ecosystem and yours, I know, and others elsewhere in the world. So we're strongly advocating through our work now to kind of reframe that food security conversation into one of food resilience, which brings, again, a much broader range of considerations into the conversation and just releases us from constantly thinking about yield. And people were very, very warm. There were lots of farmers in the room in that conference, and they were very warm to the kind of creative and innovative solutions that they themselves are so well placed to develop and work with.
Angela, would you like to chip in on this one?
So after the Kaikoura earthquake, it's about 8 years ago now, I think, we worked out that the area of Kaikoura, which is about an hour north of us, or 2 hours north of us, was completely cut off. And because of the way that we design how our food is grown in New Zealand, it meant that the people of Kaikoura didn't have access or good access to fresh food at all. So there was a Navy boat that was bringing in emergency rations, but obviously you can't just live on emergency rations. And as time went on, and the engineering feat, which was to reopen this part of New Zealand to get food into it, became pretty clear that it was going to take some time. So as a family, with some friends, we loaded up a truck, pulled an inflatable dinghy behind us, took a trip across the Hundalis, which is a hill range that would give anyone for a run for its money, even on a good day, but was truly one of the most terrifying trips of my life, 2 days after that earthquake. Got down to the seashore, piled the inflatable dinghy as high as we possibly could and launched it, trying to find our way through onto a slip that worked and through the shallows, because the earthquake had lifted the seashore by about 1.5 meters, out to a big fishing boat on a point that could then run the food. That included everything from coffee beans to fresh fruit and vegetables to milk to anything we could fit on it, round for the people of Kaikoura. And it was an astonishing moment for me to realise that in those moments we expect some type of coordinated response, that we expect our government or some greater power to be there to make sure that everything is as it should be and that everybody has access to food and that we won't go hungry. And that's clearly not what happens. And in fact, as a country, we've just seen a report from Civil Defence after what happened with Cyclone Gabriel as well. And again, that lack of national coordination or ability to respond to these kind of events is incredibly limited. And personally, that absolutely drove me to the understanding that the solution in times of uncertainty and growing disruption lies with communities themselves. So I was asked by someone in MPI once, what we've got to work out how to do is to get to the bag of potatoes to the end of the line. And my response to that was, what you really need to do is to make sure that the potatoes are at the end of the line to begin with. And so how do we redesign how we see our communities to ensure that they are far more resilient than they are currently? And the frustrating thing about that story is that we're now 8 years on, and I don't necessarily see that we've addressed those problems. And the truth is, if there was another community like Queenstown that was cut off because of an earthquake, the lack of food resilience or food security, or whatever you want to call it, is incredibly small, and we would have the same issue again. So I can see that communities around New Zealand are designing their own solutions. But the problem is that they're not coordinated, they're not supported, they're not resourced. They rely on volunteers who constantly get burnt out. And there seems to be no energy or interest or understanding of the importance of community-based responses. And so that's what I'd like to say about food resilience.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Angela. And I was actually going to mention the impact of Cyclone Gabriel in Hawke's Bay, because I was at an event and actually literally moved to tears by an account of one of the volunteers that had coordinated action. And I guess the reality that it required just ordinary people, citizens, individuals, to step up and make stuff happen to prevent people from running out of food. It does seem unbelievable in an advanced economy, but that's the situation we're in. And it's been a marvellous kind of journey from the big picture of kind of national food resilience, Sue, that you were talking about, through to the really gritty reality of kind of local food resilience. And I wonder if just for a minute we could explore local food production, as well as the issue of distribution and self-organisation in those crises, and the role of kind of local production. I don't know which of you might like to go first on that. Perhaps Sue?
So we argue that strengthened local food systems are fundamentally part of a more resilient future. And we meet farmers and growers around the country who are standing ready to provide for that. What we have at the moment is a food system in the UK which is structurally designed for the way that it works at the moment, scaling up for big institutional responses. It's commodified, it's consolidated, it's financialised, and that really acts against innovation and creativity, entrepreneurship, and investing in the kind of network of relationships that local food systems actually profoundly rely on. So it isn't just about access to land and access to the right land and being able to grow the kinds of foods, produce the kinds of foods that communities need, but it's also about things like, local abattoirs and local packaging and logistics, and also being able to collaborate and cooperate in such a way that local production systems can meet the needs of towns and cities. Geographically, very similar size. UK, New Zealand, we have very, very many more people in the UK, and you can certainly feel it when you visit New Zealand. You can really feel the difference. But that means that our food system, any local food system, really does have to work out a way of finding and resourcing large conurbations. That's quite the logistical challenge. But there are places in the UK that have been thinking about that, working on that, and indeed doing that. In Preston, in Lancashire, the Preston Procurement Project is one of those poster boys, if you like, for anchor institutions working with local growers to bring local food into hospitals and schools. Similar things happening in Nottingham and Leicester, in Devon and Cornwall. But those often rely on the really relentless leadership of bonkers individuals who are really committed to making that work. The structures, the systematic structures to support that are not yet there. And it would require a real commitment from government, business, local institutions to recalibrate the way we think about things like resourcing and procuring, public procurement for the public plate, for example, to be able to shift the system from where it is to where it needs to be. But one of the calls that we've made, and it's certainly coming up in conversations in manifestos now, that every place, every community, every region in the UK needs to start placing food at the heart of its resilience planning. We do have a network of civil resilience plans, but food isn't part of those. And it absolutely does need to be, and seen to be a central part of a future that is able to respond to the shocks that we might well end up facing sooner rather than later.
So you mentioned systems are not in place to support kind of local food resilience. Angela, possibly there are even forces at play that are not perhaps supportive of a move to a more locally resilient food system?
Yes, that's one way of putting it, absolutely. I think what I want to say in that space is the opportunity to consider Indigenous food systems in this country and to understand how they designed themselves, both historically and currently as well, in terms of ensuring that people get fed, and food that sits outside of the transactional economy, or at least the money economy, and how do we rethink how we find our food as a community. And there is so much richness there and so much understanding. And I would just encourage people to talk to mana whenua, or to understand those food systems that have existed with iwi around the country, because they actually have some wonderful solutions to some of the current problems that we're facing. And as an organisation, that's something that we love celebrating and talking about. So yes, there are definitely barriers to local food systems, and it's interesting watching that global movement. But just as we are unique in terms of our challenges in some spaces, so we can be unique in terms of our solutions. So that's something that I'd really like us to spend some more time thinking about.
Yeah, me too. And I think just to round out this resilience conversation, it's a book that you may both have come across, but I would commend to you a book called What Would Nature Do by Ruth de Vries. And it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's a look at how nature pays attention to the importance of resilience and doesn't aim for efficiency in a single dimension, because that carries with it so much risk. So, but I'll be asking you both shortly for a book recommendation for our listeners. But before we do, just to begin to wrap up this conversation, I'm interested in why both of you do this work that you're doing, which is difficult work. Sue, perhaps you could tell us first, and then Angela?
Well, it's my dream job. I can't think of anything more important to be working on at the moment. That kind of intersection of food and farming and community action on climate and nature, on health, on equity. All of those things are things that I've been obsessed about in varying degrees for pretty much all my working life. And I suppose I come from a family of people who kind of lean into the problem questions. So that's good. I think I must have it in my genes. But actually, it is difficult work. I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because it's important. And I think many of us do, I certainly do, get a real sense of purpose and reward from being able to work on with some brilliant people, important work that matters. So it's difficult, but it's incredibly rewarding, and particularly rewarding to be working in this kind of network of people and organisations, communities and institutions who are all lining up behind these challenges now. We're growing a movement, aren't we? Certainly that's our mission in the UK. We're growing an unstoppable movement for change, and coming to visit you all around the other side of the world, you can see how you are also doing that. And it's pretty energising to be part of a movement.
I just absolutely reiterate that purpose is incredibly powerful and energising. We have, as part of our organisation, something called the Kaitaki, and it's 135 next generation food leaders who sit across the food system. So farmers and fishers, through to people in policy and education and health, through to chefs and event organisers, so the whole gamut. And I tap into that network whenever I need a boost. And I remind people, if they feel that the conversations that I have with them are uncomfortable in any way, shape or form, and I simply tell them that they're far better off talking to me and affecting change now, because you should see what comes next. And so I think for me, that's what genuinely drives me, is what comes next. So my children and my grandchildren and the future of us as people who live here and this beautiful planet in which we inhabit, that we're so lucky to be here for even the smallest amount of time. So while we're here, what can we do to ensure that we leave the place better than when we started? So for me, it's what drives me is the future. And as I get older, interestingly, I'm understanding that the work I've started won't be finished in my lifetime. And that's quite a moment, I think. I always imagined when I was young, I was just going to get the job done. And I'm beginning to realize that that's actually not how these things roll. And so I'm beginning to understand that at some point, it will be everyone else that's able to step forward and drive this movement to the next place that it needs to be. And so really, I'm just a stepping stone, or I'm just one person in a chain of people who will enable things to be better and to get us to a different place. I find that really humbling, but I also find it a huge relief. It's not all just on me. So yeah, I'm really, really supportive and encouraging and love what's coming next.
I think that observation about the contribution that you can make and the contribution that others will make is probably a really, really important touchstone for avoiding the burnout that we were talking about, that we see so often among people that are working in this space. And I love the fact that gratitude has come up in this conversation, whether it's the gratitude of people in the UK having the opportunity to talk about food, or Angela, your gratitude for the work that you can do and the people that you can connect with is wonderful. And I know our listeners will be grateful to you both, starting with you, Angela, if you could give a book or a podcast recommendation that you think people would find useful.
There's so many, it's kind of difficult to know where to start. I think one of the most powerful books that I've read lately, and I hope I'm not stealing your book, so would be Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. It's just an incredible, powerful insight into how we found ourselves in the situation we have over COVID, about culture wars, about polarization and misinformation in the world. It's just so informative, and it has real impact on our food system as well. It talks about the the diagonalism between the far right and the far out, and the health and wellness space. And yeah, just such a compelling book and such an original and important take on this point of time in our history.
Thank you. Sue?
Yes, I love Doppelganger too. The other book that my daughter and I have been listening to together when we were travelling around New Zealand is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I'd read it and then decided that my daughter, who's an ecologist, would also love it. And it's the most beautiful book written by First Nations woman in the United States who also becomes a biologist, a scientist, and she's able to weave together stories from her Indigenous knowledge and her Western scientific knowledge in just such a beautiful and poetic and engaging way. It's quite the antidote after listening to reading Naomi Klein, actually. And the podcast I'd choose is another brilliant woman with a wonderful voice called it's Accidental Gods with Manda Scott. And she interviews a real diverse crowd of people to talk about how we create a movement for change. And those different voices, different perspectives, different ways of leading change, mobilising change, working with change to really lean into the enormity of the crises in front of us is both inspiring and incredibly practical. So of those are my two recommendations.
Thank you very much. And just two final questions and then I'll wrap things up. Firstly, what would you suggest to listeners that they might be able to do kind of immediately tomorrow to advance this concept of a fairer, healthier, more environmentally restorative and more resilient food system? Sue?
You often hear people say at this point, consume differently, consume better, make better purchase choices. But I'm not going to do that because I think that really sticks us in this individualised consumerist mindset that we can somehow purchase our way out of the crisis that we're in. I would say find your people, find a group, find people, find networks in your community and explore all of the ways that you can build resilience into your community starting right now. Because whatever else happens, where we live, where we work, will be the same, and that's where we need to invest our time and our effort and our resources so that we're ready to face whatever comes. Find your people and make a plan.
Angela?
We live on a permaculture property here in North Canterbury, and part of our service is helping people learn how to grow their own food. So that would be my answer, is just grow some food. It literally could be a herb on a windowsill or a small amount of something, some salad greens. It's not a step towards self-sufficiency. You don't have to aim for self-sufficiency, but it's the connection to where your food comes from that changes everything. And your ability to grow something from a seed or from a tiny plant into something that nourishes you is a huge journey in terms of reconnection back to our natural world. So that's what I would go out and do tomorrow, is plant a seed.
Thank you. And now this final question sounds trivial, but I have found that it can elicit some really interesting responses from people that I have interviewed. If you had a superpower to bring about positive change in the food system, what would that be?
So for me, it's about seeing systems. I think it's a superpower that increasingly more and more people are developing. But being able to see the connections between how we live, what we do, how our economy works, how our food system works, how our politics works, to be able to see the web of connections and relationships and interdependencies, I think is the first step to being able to know where to act and what to do next. So I think, yes, seeing systems as a superpower would be my magic wand.
Wonderful.
If I had a magic wand tomorrow, I would wave it, and the food citizens of New Zealand would be in charge for the next 12 months. And so the government would have to listen to everything that they said and do everything that they said. And then after 12 months, we could all have a big hooey and sit down and work out what worked and what didn't. But for the next 12 months, New Zealand eaters get to be in charge. That's what I do.
Well, thank you both for proving my point that it may sound a trivial question, but it elicits some wonderful insights. So thank you for that. And look, it's been a really delightful, challenging, insightful conversation from my perspective, and I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
I've loved it. Thank you, Roger.
And thank you for having me and for showing me around your beautiful country.
Absolute pleasure. So have you given me cause for hope? Just because you are both working on this problem, I have hope. So thank you for that. Have you given me a call for action or given our listeners a call for action? And I think you have. And I really love the idea that we should find our people and just grow some food. Really practical, implementable advice. So thank you very much for that. And for the listeners out there, thank you so much for listening to this episode of my podcast series. If you're interested in more conversations about people, planet, food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review the show. And please share with others that you think might be interested in this series. If you've got any suggestions for people that you think you'd like to hear from that I should interview, please let me know. You can contact me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz. And next up, I will be talking to Martin Rich, who's the CEO of the UK's Future Fit Foundation, but more on that to come. Until then, mā te wā. See you next time.